a thread that connects all the Trump pardons, which is his transactional approach to life. He punishes his enemies and rewards his friends, and that's how he uses the pardon power. He pardoned everyone that Robert Mueller had prosecuted because he hated Robert Mueller. That's how he punishes his enemies. Mm-hmm. If you look at these recent pardons, they are the Chrisleys and their daughter. Their daughter spoke at the Republican convention. They were big Trump supporters. This crooked sheriff he pardoned in Virginia, also a big Trump supporter. Another guy he pardoned, the family had given $1 million to the inauguration. He is a transactional person. He does not concern himself with morality to any meaningful extent.
Right.
And that's the connective tissue of all these pardons.
You're never going to be perfectly happy all the time. The best you can hope for is to be reasonably happy. Reasonably happy. Most of the time. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Reasonably Happy. My guest today is Jeffrey Toobin. He is a legal analyst on CNN, a contributor to the New York Times opinion page, and the author of a whole mess of interesting books, including several that I've read: Homegrown, Timothy McVeigh and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism; The Run of His Life, The People versus O.J. Simpson, which was made into an FX series called American Crime Story, The People versus O.J. Simpson, which was awesome. And his new book, which we're going to talk about, it's called The Pardon, The Politics of Presidential Mercy, which could not be more timely. And I don't care where you sit on the political spectrum, there is so much to be learned in talking about the pardon today, about our country, about the Constitution, and whether things work the way they should work or not. Welcome, Jeffrey Toobin.
Hiya, Paul.
Thanks for coming, man. It's great to meet you.
It's great to be here.
Before we dive into the book, I want to start where I normally start and ask you, where and when do you find yourself the happiest?
Fortunately, I thought about that question when I was, coming over here, and I thought, I'm happy a lot of the time.
Yeah?
And that's a very fortunate thing to be able to say. My mother, who grew up in the sort of Freudian 50s, said, what matters is work and love. Mm. And I am fortunate to be happily married and have at least one kid in the vicinity. Unfortunately, my daughter has moved to Chicago. So just being around my family, we have a weekend house in Connecticut. Mm-hmm. I live in Manhattan. My wife and I play golf together. That makes me happy. But I also like my work. I mean, I really like writing. I've never had a problem sort of what is sometimes called writer's block.
I sure don't seem to have it.
No. I mean,
based on your output,
but also just the process of reporting and writing.
Yeah.
When I have been really happy professionally, I remember very early in my career I did a piece about involving 3 strikes and you're out, that law in California. And I went to San Luis Obispo prison, where more than half of the prisoners are doing life. Mm. And I remember walking around the prison thinking, this is totally great. I love being here. I just it was so weird. And when I was writing the Timothy McVeigh book, most of the plot was thought up in rural central Kansas, not even agricultural Kansas, but really bizarre rural Kansas. And I would go riding on those, 2-lane roads, and I was thinking, this is great. I just love being here. So that,
because you get to, and I was thinking about this, about what it is that you do, and it seems like you take these things that people have a vague familiarity with. Or, okay, Timothy McVeigh, I remember him, and I can't remember the co-conspirator, you create the context and historical background of these things and dive deep so people who have sort of a surface level familiarity can go, oh, There's a lot more here to this subject than I was aware of.
Absolutely. And one of the career, whether I'm writing about OJ or the Monica Lewinsky scandal or the recount in Florida, people will say, oh, everybody knows that story. One thing I learned is they don't know that story.
And our memories aren't very good.
Well, that's right. I mean, to the extent they remember anything other than the result, their memories are wrong because they just don't remember. But also, they just don't know. I mean, there was no story more covered in my lifetime probably than the O.J. Simpson case.
Yeah.
But there was, especially in the immediate aftermath, and even as was illustrated in the wonderful series based on my book on FX, people are still curious, and they don't know. They remember these names. They remember Cato Kalin. They remember Johnny Cochran. They remember, Al Cowlings. But they don't really like who they were or what their roles were. And that's a fun thing to be able to go back and reconstruct a story in the kind of detail that I like to do at book length.
What's it like to be on the front lines of a story like that?
Well, one of the things I remember vividly, particularly about the O.J. case, was that, the trial was in Los Angeles. The judge was Lancito. And the courtroom, I would say, held about 80 people, in all the benches. And it was really hard to get in there. And the press pass situation was complicated. Fortunately, I had one. And I remember, various celebrities, particularly television celebrities, of that era, like Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer, they would occasionally, come in. And you saw how excited they were. These were fairly jaded people. And that, even more than any story I'd ever covered, felt like the center of the universe. Because remember,
it's like Studio 54.
Well, and also remember, 1993, 1994, there is no internet, no social media. Cable consisted of CNN and Court TV.
Were you at CNN at the time?
I was not. I was just a writer.
Really?
At that point.
How did you get a press pass?
I worked at the New Yorker then,
right.
and I was also writing a book. And Judge Ito I had a book contract going in, and Judge Ito gave book writers, Dominic Dunn, and my beloved friend, and a couple others. We had passes, and you just felt like the center of the universe. Another time I felt that way was in Tallahassee during the recount in Florida in 2020. The period leading up to the 36 days when the outcome was uncertain, and that was in many respects the most consequential story I ever covered. I mean, believe me, I understood that OJ there was a lot of interest,
a little sexier,
but it was not, the stakes, other than for the immediate participants, wasn't as big. That's another one where I felt like, wow, I am really in the center of things.
You went to Harvard Law School.
I did.
When did you decide that practicing law wasn't what you wanted to spend your time doing?
Well, as my father used to say, to make a long story unbearable, both my parents were journalists. And my dad was Bill Moyer's producer on PBS, sort of one of the founding fathers of public television news. My mother, Marlene Sanders, was a pioneering television correspondent. She was the first network news correspondent woman to report from Vietnam in 1966.
Oh, wow.
She had a 5-minute news show in the afternoon on ABC for several years. She later went to CBS. So I grew up in a journalism environment where I was repeatedly instructed not to become a journalist because they felt it was very unsteady, and there were the whims of executives. People came and went. And so I was very much encouraged to go to law school and, maybe work in government, maybe work in politics. And I did that, but I always kept a foot in journalism. I wrote for my school newspaper in high school and college. I started freelancing for various magazines when I was in law school. But then after my clerkship, I got a job on the Iran-Contra investigation, the trial of Oliver North. And I was so intrigued by that I decided to write a book about it. And, the book was well received. But then I went to be a assistant U.S. attorney in Brooklyn because I thought the book was sort of a one-off thing. But after 3 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office, Tina Brown had been hired as the editor of The New Yorker. I sort of, on a whim, offered, to write as a talk of the town writer, short pieces, and she hired me.
And this is the heyday of magazine journalism.
Correct. It was really boom times, and Tina was and is a tremendously charismatic and significant person. And it was only a year after I started at The New Yorker that the O.J. case happened. And that, Tina assigned me to cover it.
Wow.
I wrote a very high-profile piece about how the defense was going to accuse Mark Furman, the detective, of being a racist and planting the glove. I became very associated with that. I started appearing on the Today Show and Larry King Live regularly, just as a guest, not as a paid. So that once OJ happened, I was sort of launched as a journalist officially. But I hasten to add, none of this was really planned out. I mean, it all was kind of improvisational.
But that's how things happen.
Well,
right?
that's and that's a very I'm not a big one for imparting life lessons, but man plans, God laughs is a good rule to live by. But it's a good rule to embrace as well. I look at the world that my kids are, who are now young adults, they are both, doing the kind of work that, one's in business, the other's in law, but the kind of things they deal with didn't even exist when I got out of law school.
Well, right. And if they said, I want to be a long-form magazine journalist, you'd be like, maybe that's not the place for you to go right now.
And that is something that makes me sad.
Sure.
I mean, that I am not someone who hates progress and hates change. So I am, and I know a lot of people who are that way. So I'm not that way. But I do think there are aspects of journalism, especially journalism, that we have lost, and it is a real loss. I mean, long-form journalism, there are not many places where you can do it anymore, especially if you want to make a living. And even worse is the situation with newspapers in the United States.
Totally.
I was never a newspaper reporter, but when you look at, and my wife's from Cincinnati, and you look at, when she was growing up, you had the morning paper and the afternoon paper, and they were big, profitable enterprises. Now there's barely one newspaper.
Thanks, Craigslist.
Yeah, well, the Craigslist was the start
of
the that killed classifieds, but it was also just the internet writ large that and the decision by a lot of journalistic entities, especially newspapers, to put their content on the web for free. Which, and they thought they'd make it up in advertising or whatever, and all it did was convince our audience that news was free.
A commodity.
Yeah. And that is a decision, it's easy to say it was wrong now.
Well, what
was
were
the alternative?
Right.
I mean, people would not have paid.
You might be able to hold back progress, but you're not going to stop it.
Right. So anyway, but so in that respect, I think it's a major loss both for journalists and the world. But
coincidentally, in 45 minutes, the person coming in for my next interview is the CEO of Puck, which is
John.
No, Sarah Personette.
Oh, Sarah. Oh, wow. See, John Kelly is the founder of Puck,
right? Yeah.
Right. And they have been so successful that they now have more than one person at the top, which is great.
Go. Yeah.
But and that's another thing that's worth remembering is that for all that the internet has destroyed a lot in journalism, it has also created things. I mean,
but the model hasn't really been cracked on a mass scale.
Not and particularly on a local scale, it hasn't been. Bloomberg News is a tremendous success.
I
It's
subscribe.
all online. Puck is a much smaller enterprise, but seems to be doing well.
Yeah.
And you have Semaphore, you have the Huffington Post, you have other online publications. But to compare that to a world with the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Hartford Courant, and the L.A. Times and the San Francisco Chronicle, those were giant profitable enterprises. So you're right that there has not been anything near a replacement for those.
All right, let's talk about your book.
Okay.
Because like I said, this is one of those things you're like,
Okay.
oh, the pardon. No, that sounds could be dry, but turns out it's fascinating, and
Yeah.
there's a very, very deep history there that's consequential to who we are as a country. So before we dive in, let's define our terms. What is the pardon, and where does it come from?
Okay. Well, one of the things that attracted me to this story is that pardons, presidential pardons, are an anomaly in our system. I think most people know our Constitution is based on the concept of checks and balances. The pardon is one of the very few parts of the Constitution where there is no check on the president, and it comes most directly from the powers of the King of Great Britain. I mean, who also had a pardon power. And for that reason, one of the ideas behind the book is that you can learn a tremendous amount about a president by knowing how he exercises the pardon power, because it is solely at his discretion. And I write that it's like an X-ray into the souls of presidents, and I think that gets proven every day.
More and more,
yes.
Okay, so are there criteria for pardons?
Well, one of the answer to that question, I'd never really been asked that in that way. The answer is really no. Presidents can establish criteria. The Justice Department has something called the Office of the Pardon Attorney.
I didn't know that existed.
And it has a very elaborate system of applying for a pardon, which has many standards like contrition, rehabilitation, apology, but it's all purely advisory. And especially in recent years, certainly under Trump and Biden, the presidents have ignored the pardon office, and they pardon whoever they want for whatever reason they want. And so the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, which defines the pardon power, does not say anything about who should be pardoned or why, which is yet another reason why you can learn so much about presidents by whom they decide to pardon.
Indeed. Real quick, pardon versus commutation versus reprieve and amnesty.
Okay, those are four different categories in the overall category of clemency. They're all clemency, and the two that really matter are pardons and commutations, because the other two haven't really been used very much in history. A pardon is a complete elimination of a criminal conviction, meaning it can have no more legal consequences. For example, if you're pardoned, regardless of what state you're in, you can vote again
on federal charges.
Pardons presidential pardons only apply to federal crimes. All 50 states have different rules with regard to pardons, and some are similar. Some states have no pardons. Some states have sort of a board that you have to be approved by. But when we're just talking about presidential pardons, they only apply to federal crimes, and a pardon wipes out a conviction entirely. You can buy a firearm. You can vote. A commutation gets you out of prison, but your status as a convicted felon remains. So there is it's obviously very good to get a commutation if you're in prison, but it is very different from a pardon.
Okay, we're going to come back to Nixon and Watergate because you spent a lot of time on that, also very interesting. But let's talk about the benign prerogative and how it's been exercised, as you say, in revealing the president's truest self. Going back all the way to Jefferson Davis, or Andrew Johnson, who pardoned Jefferson Davis. James Buchanan pardoned Brigham Young. which I didn't even know he needed a pardon. But then I watched American Primeval on Netflix, and I was like, oh, Brigham Young was a rough dude.
Yeah, no, the founding of the Mormon, the LDS Mormon Church was no joke. I mean,
clearly
a lot of blood was shed along the way.
So Andrew Johnson and the Confederacy, we had to come back together as a nation. Was his pardon of Jefferson Davis the right thing to do?
Well, I think one of Alexander Hamilton was really the father of the pardon power, in the Constitutional Convention, and he thought that pardons were a good tool to dispense mercy, which is sort of the conventional definition of a pardon. But he also thought they were important to calm rebellions in the United States. And so that tool was part of presidents' toolboxes from the very beginning. And in fact, George Washington used the pardon power after he put down the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania, which he put down the rebellion, but he pardoned all the people who had been involved, which calmed the political waters. Abraham Lincoln did the same thing after the Civil War in a much more consequential way, but he only did it with the foot soldiers. He issued an amnesty, which is like a group pardon, for any soldier who agreed to pledge allegiance to the Union. He, of course, is assassinated as the war is ending, and Andrew Johnson takes over, who was much more sympathetic to the South and the leadership of the South.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, pardoned Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, completely outraging the radical Republicans who were the core of Lincoln's supporters. I think Johnson's pardon of Davis, especially so soon after the war, was a terrible mistake and contributed to the South's resistance to really integrating itself, especially on racial matters, with the rest of the country. But again, it tells you a lot about Andrew Johnson that he pardoned Jefferson Davis, and it tells you a lot about Lincoln that he didn't pardon Jefferson Davis.
Right. Notable other pardons in more recent history. Nixon pardoned Jimmy Hoffa. Carter pardoned the Vietnam draft dodgers, something I may have known but didn't remember. Patty Hearst after, wait a minute, was it Clinton that pardoned Patty Hearst? Carter commuted her sentence and Clinton pardoned her.
Correct. And Patty Hearst, whom your listeners probably remember, was kidnapped by a crazy
granddaughter
group
of the Hearst,
William Randolph
right.
Hearst, at a time, again, going back to our earlier conversation, when the Hearsts, a newspaper family,
right.
were so rich and powerful,
crazy wealthy.
Well, and built the largest private residence in the United States at San Simeon. Yep. She was kidnapped by this crazy group called the Symbionese
SLA.
Liberation Army. Got involved in bank robberies, was convicted in a very celebrated trial, but Jimmy Carter let her out of prison early. Many years later, 20 years later, Bill Clinton, at Jimmy Carter's instigation, pardoned her altogether. I wrote a book about that too. So it's a subject very, very close to my heart.
So the other Carter pardon that's notable, or another one of them that's notable, is Billy Carter, which sets off a trend of people pardoning their family members, like Clinton pardoning his half-brother Roger Clinton, and President Biden pardoning several of his family members.
And this is part of why pardons are so controversial, because presidents can use them in ways that seem to benefit their families in a unseemly way. And I think of myself, it's sort of paradoxical, as I've been talking about my book, my book is full of pardons I disapprove of.
Sure.
Including, the main one, which is Ford's pardon of Nixon. But I still support the pardon power. I still think we have so many reasons in this country to put people in prison. Any opportunity to get them out is a good one. But the pardon power, I think, has been used poorly and many times especially in recent years. So my solution is not to get rid of the pardon power, but to have better presidents. So Paul, I'd like you to get to work on that.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's my solution.
I think that's the right idea, and the more conversations I'm having with people like you, the more I'm like, how do you get there? I did not vote for Trump anytime. I was not a supporter of Biden either, though I did vote for him in 2020. And you think about, his actions around Hunter, and you're like, well, on the one hand, does the country need to see Hunter strung up by the Trump administration? The answer is probably no. However, it also gives Trump some fuel to go off on this pardon binge of his to say, well, Biden did it, why can't
exactly. It created the opportunity for false equivalency, which is a disease that we have in our news media.
Yes.
But it did. My objection to the Hunter Biden pardon was not so much, it gave Trump a license to do something bad. Trump was going to do it anyway. I mean, yes. I don't think it had. I think it was a political talking point that he made use of, and Republicans made use of. But I don't think it really was all that consequential. The reason I objected to the Hunter Biden pardon was that it contributed to people's cynicism about
yes.
how powerful people get away with things. Yes, it's true that Hunter Biden had been treated harshly by the criminal justice system. But it is also true that he was convicted of a crime in Delaware of lying on his gun application. He was convicted or pleaded guilty to crimes in California for tax offenses. And, a lot of people are treated harshly by the criminal justice system, but their fathers are not president of the United States, and so they can't get away with it. And I certainly understand Biden's wanting to protect his son. Again, revealing presidents. One of the things about Joe Biden is that he was kind of obsessed in an even unusual degree with his own family. Mm-hmm. And, his story had so much tragedy in it. His first wife and daughter dying in that terrible car accident. His son dying of cancer when Joe Biden was vice president. And I think Joe Biden was convinced that, Hunter's problems were in some way Joe's own responsibility. I don't believe that, especially for a man in his 50s as Hunter Biden is. But again, it just tells you a lot about Joe Biden, that he would take the political heat for doing something that he knew could get a lot of criticism.
Well, and not to go off on a tangent, but have you read Original Sin, Tapper and Thompson's book? I mean, that in combination with the deception that is cataloged in that book makes people feel very, cynical about the Biden presidency.
Right, and I can understand that, and again, it leads to a kind of equivalency that is not, I think, justified under the circumstances, but it is not crazy for people to say, oh, these politicians, they're all the same. They're not the same, but when you do something like deceive the country about your mental acuity and lie about whether you're going to pardon your son, right, it contributes to people's cynicism.
And again, this is a historical precedent. Clinton pardoned Mark Rich, the giant campaign donor.
No, he was not his ex-wife was a campaign donor. And
I very think, connected dude,
right? Well, and look, I think it was a terrible pardon. Mm-hmm. I think it was bad that Clinton did it. I think some of the criticism was over the top. The real reason he pardoned Mark Rich was that in the last days of his presidency, he had tried very, very hard to make a Middle East peace deal between Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader, and Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time. Barak was the person who implored Clinton to pardon Mark Rich. It really came from the Israeli side.
Right.
I think it was very poor judgment of him to do it, but it was not a corrupt thing. Mm-hmm. for what it's worth.
Okay, so let's not spend too much time on it, but Trump is obviously his own person in this regard, having pardoned, 1,500 of the January 6 participants. And then bizarrely in the last week, Larry Hoover, the founder of the Gangster Disciples of Chicago, and Todd and Julie Chrisley of the reality show Chrisley Knows
Right,
Best.
but there is a thread that connects all the Trump pardons, which is his transactional approach to life. He punishes his enemies and rewards his friends, and that's how he uses the pardon power. He pardoned everyone that Robert Mueller had prosecuted because he hated Robert Mueller. That's how he punishes his enemies. Mm-hmm. If you look at these recent pardons, they are the Chrisleys and their daughter. Their daughter spoke at the Republican convention. They were big Trump supporters. This crooked sheriff he pardoned in Virginia, also a big Trump supporter. Another guy he pardoned, the family had given $1 million to the inauguration. He is a transactional person. He does not concern himself with morality to any meaningful extent,
right.
And that's the connective tissue of all these pardons. The January 6 pardons, the 1,500 rioters. Donald Trump was a January 6 defendant as well. Different charges, not for the riot, but what he was saying to the world in a very explicit way was they did nothing wrong because they were supporting me and my effort to win an election that I won, and there was nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Again, it's a transactional approach. It's like, well, I wasn't wrong, so they weren't wrong, and that's how he approaches pardons.
All right, let's go back to the big pardon.
Okay.
How would the world be different if Jerry Ford had not pardoned Richard Nixon?
Well, I'm not sure it would be that different. One of the peculiarities we talked about, sort of researching a story that people think they know. The reason Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon was that he thought he was going to be prosecuted, and he thought that was a bad thing for the world to have.
And Al Haig pushed him into it.
And Al Haig, pushed him. But I learned in the course of reporting this book that Leon Jaworski, who was the Watergate special prosecutor, didn't want to prosecute Nixon, and he was the one who would have to make that decision. So by rushing into this pardon and not vetting the decision with a broader group of people, Ford, bought himself essentially an unnecessary problem.
He didn't have to pardon because the special prosecutor, kind of like Robert Hur, who said he wasn't going to prosecute Biden because he wasn't going to winnable. He wanted to do it for different reasons, but he said he wasn't going to do it. So Ford kind of threw it out there.
Blundered into it, yes.
And he could have been president probably in 76.
Well, that's one of the questions, and I talk about this in the book, that a lot of people think Ford lost the election in significant part, lost the election to Jimmy Carter because people were still angry about the pardon. That's a hard case to prove, and if you go through the campaign as I did, and I did the research in some detail, the pardon wasn't as big a part of the campaign as I thought it was. It was like a more conventional campaign about the state of the economy, but it certainly was a background fact that didn't help Ford. But I also think you ask how would the world be different. I think the pardon was something that contributed to the cynicism of people about American politics, that powerful people get away with things that underlings don't, and that ordinary people don't. So in that respect, I don't know that you can pinpoint exactly the consequence, but I do think that the pardon hardened our cynicism about how people get away with things.
My favorite factoid in the book was the way E. Howard Hunt's attempt to pay discounted country club dues contributed to the investigation.
Well, Paul, one thing we share in common is an interest in golf.
Yes.
And I loved this fact so much. I'm so glad that you point out.
I'm an out-of-town member at a club, and
right.
I understand.
Just to explain the context, one of the big issues in the Watergate investigation was what was the connection of the burglars who were caught in the act of trying to bug the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate to people who worked in the White House. E. Howard Hunt worked in the White House. One of the Watergate burglars had in his possession an envelope. The burglar lived in Florida. Eugenio Martinez was the name of him, and Howard Hunt belonged to a country club in Maryland, lived in Maryland, but he had previously lived in Miami, and he wanted the cheaper non-resident membership of his country.
Which is 75% off dues,
right?
That can add up.
So he asked Martinez to mail the envelope from Miami, pretending that he still lived there, but it turned out to be something that tied the Watergate burglars to the White House.
Because it was on him when he got arrested.
On him when he got arrested, yeah.
Now, after you break into the Watergate Hotel, mail this from a post office in Miami.
Since we're on the subject of Eugenio Martinez, a very obscure figure who was in the Watergate, there was a fact in my book that my wife, who edits my book, my editor, all implored me to take out, and I ultimately did take out, and I regret it. Okay, here's the fact about Eugenio Martinez. He was played in the movie All the President's Men, very minor part, by Dominic Chianese. Dominic Chianese went on to play Junior Soprano on the Sopranos. It is a meaningless fact that is of interest apparently only to me.
No, I would have found that interesting.
But anyway, so that's a small connection of everything to everything.
You described Ford's pardon of Nixon as a bad pardon for an honorable reason. Does intent matter?
Yeah, it does matter when we're evaluating presidential actions, because one of the big accusations against Ford in the aftermath of the pardon was that he had made some sort of corrupt deal with Nixon, that there was a quid pro quo. Nixon said, "I will give you the presidency if you give me a pardon."
They thought that's what he was accused of.
That's what he was accused of. And one thing that I think I established very clearly in the book is that did not happen, that there was no corrupt deal. Ford, was not directly offered that kind of deal because of the timing, but more importantly, Ford was too honorable a person to do that. He just never would have done that, and I don't think he did do that. However, as your question implied, I don't think that justified the pardon. I think the pardon was still a bad idea, but I think Ford's motives were actually decent. He thought that the prospect of a criminal prosecution of a former president would damage the country, and he thought that a pardon would be a healing act. I think he was mistaken both about how healing it was and whether it was appropriate to kind of to heal the country in that way. But I do think he did it for the right reasons.
When you're diving into the time and place of 1973 to 76 and 77, does it make you think that we have always had as much craziness in our politics as we feel today, or is what we're going through historically unique?
I think it's very easy to idealize the past and think that, our politics were so honorable in those days. Now, politics has always been a rough business.
But you had Vietnam and Watergate. The country was torn apart.
That's true, but the big difference to me between then and now, and this is something that really hit me in researching this pardon, was how the difference in the journalistic world has led to a difference in the political world.
How so?
In
the president
1974,
was threatening Katharine Graham.
I understand that,
to not publish the
I'm not.
the
But in
Pentagon papers.
1973, '74, the heart of this book, there was Walter Cronkite, there was the three network news shows, there were no national newspapers, there was no internet, there was no cable news. So you had a system in the country where everyone more or less believed the same set of underlying
shared
facts. Shared set of facts. Now, people drew different conclusions from those facts, but there was a generally shared set of facts. Because of the internet, because of cable, that doesn't exist anymore. People can choose their own reality, their own facts, by whether they watch Fox or whether they watch CNN. They can choose their own reality based on which Substacks they follow, which websites they follow, and that contributes to a kind of splintering that is really different from then.
And we also didn't know that JFK was a philanderer. We didn't know that the Catholic Church was covering up massive pedophilia scandals, these kinds of things. Where's the balance? How much knowledge is the right amount of knowledge?
Paul, I think that question is kind of above my pay grade. I don't.
Damn it! I need an answer, Jeffrey.
The answer of should we have not invented the internet? How the fuck do I know? I don't. It's like, here it is.
Yeah.
I'm trying to navigate my way as a journalist, as a citizen through
it. I just got to make it to 85.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So I find it hard to answer a question of that magnitude,
right.
But I'm sort of more interested in the baby steps of trying to do a decent job in the world that we do live in.
Well, you're doing a good job providing historical context. I want to talk about. I was thinking about this. Who won't Trump pardon? Sam Bankman-Fried.
I'm not sure he won't pardon Sam Bankman-Fried. I think, one of the remember, one of the big transformations that Trump has gone through during his second term is he's become Mr. Crypto.
Right.
And Sam Bankman-Fried was someone who was convicted in a crypto scandal, but someone who was ultimately one of the founding fathers of crypto. So I don't think it is at all out of the question. And frankly, I think Sam Bankman-Fried got an excessive sentence. I mean, I didn't follow the trial closely. I followed it closely enough to believe that he was guilty of what he was charged with. But 25 years? That's a really long sentence. And so I think that is something that will figure into Trump's calculations.
Jared Fogle.
Oh, the subway guy. Is he in charge in federal prison?
I don't. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. That's the lawyer in you.
Yeah, that's the lawyer in you. That's a pretty bad crime.
Diddy, along those lines.
Well, Diddy is an interesting case of someone that Trump had been close to at one point. I mean, Diddy, as far as I can tell, is so insane that he has also been against Trump. I think but he was also prosecuted. The case was initiated under the Biden administration, so that's something in Diddy's favor. I mean, the sexual violence at the heart of the case is so repellent that might talk Trump out of it. But I don't Trump was asked about this. He didn't say no.
Oh, he was asked about it?
Yeah, and he didn't say no. He said, I'm going to look into it. And so I don't think it's out of the question that Diddy gets pardoned. If Diddy winds up getting convicted in a very long sentence, I think that would actually increase the chances of a pardon or a commutation.
Okay, gotcha. All right, now we're going to play true or false.
Okay.
Where I'm going to read a statement, you say true or false.
Okay.
True or false, Ruth Bader Ginsburg messed up by dying?
Well, true. But what she really messed up by was not retiring before
Right,
she
yes.
died. Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to blame her for having cancer. That's
Yes.
not exactly that's an.
We're trying to make
unkind
headlines
thing.
here,
Okay.
Jeffrey.
Yes.
Come on.
Right. Yeah. But it was a selfish act not to retire while
Or
Obama was
certainly
president.
short-sighted. We wouldn't.
Well, selfish. I
Yeah.
think.
Okay. True or false? Evel Knievel took fashion advice from Liberace.
Totally true.
That was
I
so
love,
revealing.
Isn't that fun? Yeah.
Yeah. And you
Yeah.
go, oh, that makes sense.
It makes sense when the other person he sort of looked like was late Elvis, who was
Yes,
also prominent
100%.
in that era. Yeah, I mean the reason Paul is asking that question is Evel Knievel's failed attempt to cross the Snake River Canyon was September 8th, 1974, the same day as the Ford pardon of Nixon. Which how I opened the book.
I vaguely remember like the ABC Wide World of Sports, like of that and the parachute.
Evel Knievel was a big Wide World of Sports guy.
Yeah.
That he was on a lot for his attempting to jump things in the Astrodome
Yeah.
or Caesar's Palace. Or
Jim Lampley was here a month or so ago promoting his book. We had a fun conversation about the crazy stuff he used to have to cover on Wide World of Sports.
Yeah, I always remember I watched it. Is it Acapulco cliff diving? Remember
Right,
that?
yeah.
That was always on there. As someone who has a considerable fear of heights, I
me too.
found it just chilling to watch.
True or false? Hunter Biden is a national treasure.
Is there anyone who says true?
I don't
know.
I-
False.
you're the first person
False.
I've asked.
No, I think, I really think, look, I don't blame people for being addicts, but I blame him for not taking steps to make his father's life easier.
Right.
I think he could have done things by pleading guilty, by not seeking a pardon, by doing things for his father's good instead of being the incredible burden he's been to his father. So no, he's not a national treasure.
True or false? O.J. Simpson only wanted to be loved.
Wow, false. It's funny. I've talked a lot about the O.J. case over the years, and people always used to ask me, did O.J. do it? And I would say, as I say now, yes. But it is interesting. I've never been asked it quite that way.
Well, I think actually O.J. did want to be loved. Like that's all he he wanted to be adored and appreciated. And I mean, I of course wrote that question to be
Right.
provocative, but I think
Right.
at the root of it, he wanted to be adulated, and that was part of the reason he turned.
Well,
he
yeah,
was psychotic.
Well, I think that's true. That certainly in his day-to-day life, he loved the fact that people came up to him and said, "Oh, you're great." I think he also was someone who engaged in domestic violence for a very long time.
Oh yeah.
And that's a personality type as well that can coexist with wanting
Narcissism.
narcissism and wanting to be loved
Yeah.
as well.
Okay, last one. True or false? Life as we know it is an illusion, and even if it's not, within 3 years, we will all be subjects of our AI overlord, so none of this matters anyway.
As I said earlier, kind of above my pay grade.
Okay, all right.
But I also I think we need to be, and I say this out of not any considerable knowledge of the subject. The tech world is prone to a great deal of hype.
Yeah.
And AI is going to do X, AI is going to do Y. AI, so far as I can tell, AI hasn't done all that much. I did
ChatGPT.
GBT. I said, write me a letter that applies to be general manager of the Mets, a job that I am completely unqualified for. And it was fun, and it wrote a kind of silly letter, and I got a kick out of it. But I recognize it's going to have a big influence, but I also think, and also I think it's important not to fight technology.
Yeah.
All this idea that, people have to, promise they're not using AI, don't use AI. Look, it's here. People are going to use it. I think that, we should be teaching kids to use it properly, not to, pretend that it doesn't exist, because it does exist. It's like telling kids don't use a calculator when you're doing arithmetic.
Yes, except that calculators, and I've had this big fight with my kids recently where they haven't been taught their times tables the way we were. And they were like, we don't need to know that, and I'm like, well, you kind of do need to know that.
Well, but I
at a
think
fundamental, you should be able to go,
you,
what's 3 times it's 6? And I'm not saying it's that fundamental, but that they couldn't do that. But it's like there's some calculation you shouldn't have to think about that should be intuitive.
Maybe I'm thinking, I would be wary of a little old fogeyism on your part.
You're older than me, man.
No, I believe me, but old fogey is a state of mind. As well, believe me, I know that I am older than you are, sadly, but it's. I don't know what you really need to know, and I think that's something we're going to have to figure out.
So as a writer, and I've turned the corner on AI. Like I think it's the geometric growth of its productivity and is going to change the world in a massive, massive way and have incredible implications on. For example, like media planning. I'm talking my next guest used to work in advertising agencies, and it's like ChatGPT could do the work of 10 media planners in an hour. And as a writer, is it important that your kids know how to take a topic and pull it apart and put it back together again?
Yes, but I mean, like for example, there was an experiment by a law professor recently who asked AI to write legal briefs, on a subject that he was familiar with, and he said they did an okay job. He said he would have done a better job, but it was not a bad. I think this is going to be an evolving process of teaching people what they need to know. Obviously, I want people to be intelligent, but for example, spelling. How important is spelling?
As the parent of a dyslexic, I realize it's not that important.
It's not that. That it is not a shameful thing that all of our word processing programs correct our spelling. We have a disagreement about how important arithmetic is.
Yeah.
I don't know what the rules are, but I think we need to be flexible in adapting to what machines can do for us, because they're going to do it for us, and we need to learn how to use machines in a way that makes the world a better place.
All right, a couple more questions.
Okay.
I'll let you go. Who's your favorite comedian?
Jim Gaffigan, for a very specific reason. You want to hear the specific reason? I do. Okay. During the pandemic, like a lot of people, I spent a lot of time driving around, and on Sirius XM, I discovered the up in the 90s stand-up comedy. There's a lot of stand-up comedy, and I came across Gaffigan. Okay, that's the background. But the real background is when my son was a teenager, he was a soccer player, and on a travel soccer team, and I was one of the dads, and I drove them to a lot of games. Our Adams team had Muslims on it who couldn't eat at McDonald's, so we went to Subway all the time. I ate so many meals at Subway. Jim Gaffigan, I heard on Sirius XM, has a routine about Subway that is so hilarious and so perfect, and doesn't suggest, it proves that he has a deep, deep knowledge of Subway, as do I. And it was that routine that got me interested in Gaffigan. And I actually, my wife and I went to see him at the Beacon here in New York recently. And he's very funny. He's
great. And you can listen to him with your kids in the car, which is a great thing to hear your 9-year-olds laughing at the same thing you're laughing at.
It's interesting. And who's doing Nate Bargatze? Is he also, this sort of clean comedy? What's interesting about stand-up on Sirius is that there is also unbelievably dirty
raw dog,
and even on the regular channels, it's just unbelievably dirty. But the ratio of truly funny to not funny, I find, is about the same in clean and dirty. Some of the dirty stuff is very funny. Some of the clean stuff is very funny. But the dirtiness is not what makes it funny. It's like how good the comedians are.
I agree. How did you?
It's a longer answer.
No, I
than
love
you
it. I
wanted.
love it. No. I could talk about comedy all day.
Yeah.
And I figure you don't get asked about comedy a
No,
whole lot.
I do not.
You also probably don't get asked about golf that much because even people who read your books don't necessarily know you were a golfer. How'd you get into the sport?
Well, my grandmother, like many grandmothers, lived in Florida, and when I was 13, my parents sent me down for spring break. She didn't know what to do with me. She had picked up golf late in life. She brought me to the golf course, gave me a couple of lessons, and I liked it. I mean, I was kind of an athletic kid. I played a lot of basketball, tennis, baseball, but I really liked it and always played a few times a year. But once, as I told you, our kids became teenagers and wanted nothing to do with us, my wife, who also played golf as a kid, we joined a golf club and we play together a lot. And I love golf. And I mean, like, I used to be a huge sports fan. I'm really not much of a sports fan anymore, except professional golf, which I follow very closely.
Me too.
I'm very lucky to write for Golf Digest sometimes. So golf is a big part of my life.
I linked to your story about Jack Nicklaus in a piece I wrote on my Substack, and it was funny because I was reading it and I was like, who wrote a 8,000-word article about Jack Nicklaus in Golf Digest? I was like, oh, that's Jeffrey Toobin.
Well,
I had no idea you were even wrote for Golf Digest.
In my journalism career, I have been privileged to meet presidents of the United States and famous people in all sorts of fields. When I was getting ready to meet Jack Nicklaus, I could barely fucking breathe. I was so excited.
Because you had to ask him hard questions,
Well,
too.
I had to ask him hard questions, but also, when you are a serious golf fan, as I am, and you understand the magnitude of his accomplishments as a golfer, and had followed him through decades, I was just so in awe. And, to see him as a, physically diminished man in his 80s was sort of all the more amazing to think that, he did the things he could have done back in the day.
Bigger than Tiger Woods.
Well, this
more
is
majors than Tiger Woods.
Well, certainly more majors. The issue of Ben Hogan, Jack Nicklaus, Tiger Woods, who was the greatest golfer, is something that we could talk for a long time.
I'd love to read your analysis.
Well, but
especially given Scotty's what he's doing right now.
Scotty is, setting himself on a course where he could be in that conversation. He's obviously at this point a long way off, but I do think that one of the great things about golf is that it is still just ultimately measured by how many majors you win. And the fact that Jack Nicklaus won 18 and Tiger Woods won 15, that means Nicklaus was the greater golfer.
Yeah.
But Scotty Scheffler is shy of 30 years old when golfers traditionally reach their peak in their 30s and even into their 40s. And he's already won 3 majors and is, so clearly the dominant golfer. It's hard to keep it up. Yeah. I mean, my favorite golfer.
It's very streaky sport.
My favorite golfer is Jordan Spieth, who looked like he was going to be in that conversation. Won three majors before he was 25, but has hit harder times.
But if you look at like Jason Day, Dustin Johnson, all these guys are super hot for 18 to 21 months, and then it's just hard to maintain it.
It's really hard.
All right,
really hard.
Jeffrey Toobin. What a surprise I get to talk golf with you and talk about The Pardon. I highly recommend his book, The Pardon, The Politics of Presidential Mercy. Get yourself a very easy listening or reading book and learn something this summer. Jeffrey, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Paul.